We are glad that you come back to the Books and Music Show. And today we've got an interesting topic. We're going to talk about the Washington Circus. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you for that very warm introduction. As you know, if you've been watching the show, the past few shows, we've been talking about the political dimensions, particularly of the judicial confirmation process, because as most of you are probably aware, there's now another very contentious Supreme Court nomination that's become mired in this manufactured scandal on the part of the Democrats. The seat in question was occupied by Anthony Kennedy, and we've already discussed the previous confirmation fight that led to Justice Kennedy being appointed, which was, of course, something that's become iconic in judicial politics as sort of it's become almost the archetype for a smear campaign. In fact, the judge who was rejected, Judge Robert Bork, his name has become a verb, borking, which is synonymous with smearing the reputation of a heretofore well-regarded and esteemed judge who happens to be conservative and an originalist in terms of jurisprudence, in order to prevent him from ascending to the highest court in the land. And the Democrats have, if anything, escalated their tactics since they thwarted the nomination of Judge Bork. Now, instead of merely distorting and manipulating reporting on someone's judicial record, casting, as they did with Robert Bork, casting him as an arch segregationist and someone who wanted to do away with women's rights and all sorts of other aspersions that had no basis in reality. Instead of merely scandalizing someone's judicial record, they're now inventing personal character defects that don't exist in order to prevent Judge Kavanaugh from becoming a Supreme Court justice. They realized that simply smearing someone as a conservative, as an originalist, wasn't successful, because they tried that with President Trump's previous nominee, Neil Gorsuch, and it was completely unsuccessful. It had virtually no impact. Now, a lot of people have posed the question, if all of these charges are confected, if all of these accusations, all of these lurid accusations are false and are merely an attempt to thwart Judge Kavanaugh from becoming an associate justice on the Supreme Court, why wasn't the same strategy employed against Neil Gorsuch when he was nominated by President Trump, and the Democrats were just as unlikely to prevent his ascension to the high court? And there are a number of reasons for that. One of the overlooked reasons why they didn't try that stratagem is because Neil Gorsuch was replacing Antonin Scalia. Him taking that seat wasn't going to materially impact the future of abortion, which is the holy grail, so to speak, of the far left. They want to preserve abortion in perpetuity, which is why they invest so much energy and so many resources trying to fight conservative Republican judicial nominees. Neil Gorsuch wasn't going to change the outcome of any 5-4 rulings. He was merely going to replace a previously reliable vote for an originalist interpretation of the Constitution. So that was one of the reasons that they were more low-key in their campaign to attack that nominee. Another reason was the fact that they tailor each assault. They tailor each attack to the seeming flaws, or what they can label as flaws in each person's in each candidate's personal history. So with Neil Gorsuch, there wasn't he didn't belong to a fraternity, and he didn't go drinking with fraternity brothers. So it would have been difficult for them to caricature him as a rampaging alcoholic. Whereas with Brett Kavanaugh, he did belong to a fraternity, and he did go drinking with his fraternity brother. So it was easy to pigeonhole him and to create this fictitious, this woolly invented caricature of a entitled white male fraternity bro that goes out and rampages like a sort of a modern day Genghis Khan, which is what the Democrats have erected as their villain, their villain, kind of their universal scapegoat. In the same way that when Amy Coney Barrett, a conservative Catholic nominee, when her name was being bandied about as a potential Supreme Court justice, they excuse me. When her name was being bandied about as a potential Supreme Court justice, they depicted her as some sort of insane, deranged lunatic for being a continuationist and for associating with this charismatic Catholic group. And Dianne Feinstein, who's at the head of this lynch mob, attacked her as a lunatic simply for believing in scriptural principles and having faith in Jesus Christ. And that's where we are at this moment in history. For the Democratic Party, having faith in Jesus is akin to being so deranged that you don't deserve to sit on the Supreme Court. But my point is, in all of these cases, there were specific narratives that were being crafted, false narratives and manipulative narratives, in order to destroy and impugn the character of Trump's judicial nominees. So each one was going to have mounds of opposition research of the sort that you get when political operatives are searching for dirt, quote unquote, on their political opponents. So that was another reason that Neil Gorsuch, that the same attacks weren't used as on Neil Gorsuch. If they could have used the same attacks and prevented him from being appointed, rest assured that's what they would have done. Now, this process, as I alluded to at the beginning of this program, has been going on since Judge Bork was nominated, and the threat of abortion being overturned became a very real, concrete possibility. Now, back then, you had very well-funded, well-organized groups like the Alliance for Justice, led by Nan Aaron, and People for the American Way, a very far-left organization created by television producer Norman Lear. You had groups like that trying to thwart Republican, conservative, originalist judicial nominees. Now, you have an even bigger, more lavishly funded, a more well-organized excuse me, campaign to stop the same nominees, because once again, the half century of liberal judicial activism inaugurated by Earl Warren and the Warren Court and justices like Blackmun and Douglas and other very far left justices who warped the Constitution. You have the real opportunity for that history to be reversed. So you have an even bigger effort an even larger effort to thwart President Trump from reshaping the Supreme Court. And you have an even bigger benefactor in the form of George Soros. Now, a lot of people invoke George Soros' name to the point where it's almost become a joke or a meme that they say, oh, well, George Soros paid such and such far-left activist in order to do X, Y, or Z. But the thing is, the reason it's become a meme is because it hinges on the truth, which is most of the attempts to implement far-left policies or to thwart reasonable constitutionalist policies, most of those efforts are bankrolled by George Soros. And it's indisputable in this case that this is an effort, the effort to thwart Judge Kavanaugh, including the effort to disseminate all of these salacious allegations led by Christine Blasey Ford, and brought up in even more speculative, wild accusations by other far-left activists. All of these are supported in some way by George Soros. For example, you may have heard about the encounter in the elevator between Jeff Flake and two women who were ostensibly abuse survivors. Well, what most of the news media, with a few exceptions like the New York Post, didn't tell you is that those two survivors are actually far-left activists that work for a George Soros-funded think tank. That think tank being the Center for Popular Democracy. Now, I'm sure most of you watching at home are scratching your heads trying to figure out what the Center for Popular Democracy is. That is an offshoot of what was known as ACORN. Now, to refresh your memories, that ACORN was a 60s era community organizing group which lobbied and pressured Congress and state governments into giving them money for a variety of reasons, including to expand welfare programs and to bankroll quote-unquote community organizers who would lobby for more left-wing policies. Now, of course, ACORN was shut down after a bipartisan vote, 97, I believe it was 97 to nothing or 97 to 3 in the U.S. Senate, which cut off $1 million in federal funding for ACORN. And the reason why they did that is because James O'Keefe, the head of Project Veritas and a protege of the late Andrew Breitbart, had undercover recordings which exposed Acorn workers as looking the other way while he described blatantly illegal activities. So, the Center for Popular Democracy is an outgrowth of this far-left radical organization that committed illegal acts and which the left still lauds as an example of grassroots community organizing. And the woman who harassed and harangued and attacked Jeff Flake inside of that elevator in a pre-orchestrated stunt was a member of this group, the Center for Popular Democracy, a George Soros-funded organization. So the people who tell you that this is some wild conspiracy theory, that these charges are being cooked up and being propounded by a well-organized left-wing cabal, the people who say that that's a conspiracy, well, in one sense, they're right. It is a conspiracy theory because what these people are doing is a conspiracy, but it's a very open conspiracy, which the media is underplaying or ignoring altogether in order to push their narrative that Christine Blasey Ford was the victim of abuse at the hands of Judge Kavanaugh. Now, an even closer tie to George Soros is the relationship between Deborah Katz and the group People for the Oversight of Government. Now, this is another far-left radical group that wrote a letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee attacking Judge Kavanaugh and attacking his character and calling for more investigations. But what most of the media didn't report is that this group is an arm of George Soros and the Open Society Institute. And the woman who sits on their board is Deborah Katz, none other than the attorney for Christine Blasey Ford. Now, if Christine Blasey Ford was merely a woman so traumatized by this abuse allegedly at the hands of Brett Kavanaugh, why didn't she hire an attorney with experience in representing sex crimes victims? Excuse me. Why didn't she hire someone who wasn't a anti-Trump, far-left, pro-amnesty activist who was being bankrolled to a certain degree by George Soros? And the answer is she didn't hire one of those nonpartisan attorneys with experience in this field because she is a political activist herself. And the real reason why she hired this attorney is because Dianne Feinstein recommended it. Now, think about that. Someone who's the ranking member on the Senate Judiciary Committee recommended the attorney who represents the chief accuser of Brett Kavanaugh and the woman who's intent on thwarting his nomination to the Supreme Court. How much of a conflict of interest is that when you stop and think about it? Why is Dianne Feinstein even allowed to opine on this issue and to involve herself in the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation when she was instrumental in finding the attorney to represent Christine Blasey Ford, an attorney associated directly with George Soros? It makes no sense when you stop and really examine the issue. And the ties go even further than that. One of her other attorneys works at a law firm which blatantly renounced any ties to him because he decided to insert himself into this blatantly political activism. And that's what it is. This isn't a judicial hearing or a criminal investigation. This is essentially a political show trial. Now, there are commentators and pundits who alluded to the trial by ordeal, a medieval punishment, or a medieval judicial proceeding which was not reliant upon either truth or falsity, but something along the lines of whether or not you were a witch. And that's what's really going on. They're trying to make Brett Kavanaugh into a witch, someone who had heretofore unimpeachable character, who's been supported by Akil Reed Amar, a very liberal, very left-wing law professor, who disagrees probably with 90% of Brett Kavanaugh's judicial opinions. Akil Reed Amar supports him, as does another very liberal female law professor, and former clerks of his who have very different political and judicial opinions. So far, the only people who believe that Brett Kavanaugh should not be on the Supreme Court, and who believe that the charges advanced by Christine Blasey Ford are credible and should prevent him from taking Anthony Kennedy's seat on the Supreme Court, are far left, feminist, pro-abortion political activists who have no problem with George Soros and what, in another circumstance, they would describe as dark money influencing the composition of the Supreme Court. And this is a circus when you stop and think about it, because it's not just the show trial aspect that we've been witnessing over the past week, bringing in a woman who has no memory of dates or circumstances or people, and can barely pinpoint the year in which this accusation, this assault took place, yet is 100% certain that Brett Kavanaugh was the one who assaulted her. It's not just the absurdity of that which makes this a circus, but the entire proceeding from the start to the finish, whenever the finish occurs. We have people like Richard Blumenthal, who is probably the primary example of stolen valor. A man who pretended to be a Vietnam War veteran who served in combat for a decade and a half in order to advance his political career as Connecticut Attorney General and eventually his current seat, United States Senator from the state of Connecticut. This is a man who literally lied about being a Vietnam vet in order to capitalize politically upon the prestige and honor that's normally associated with serving in combat and being a decorated veteran for your country. And there's really nothing you can think of that's more despicable than that. And yet he sits there and lectures Brett Kavanaugh, a man with sterling character and sterling reputation, and he sits there and lectures him on morality. It's just sick and twisted when you think about it. And Dianne Feinstein, who sat on this accusation for months until it was politically useful, and she could drag it out at the last minute when Judge Kavanaugh was on the verge of being confirmed in order to besmirch his reputation. That's to say nothing of the fact that this is the same woman who had a literal spy for the People's Republic of China working for her for decades, for years. And yet she's still allowed to be the ranking member on the Judiciary Committee and wreak havoc with the life of Brett Kavanaugh and the lives of his family. It's really sickening. Cory Booker and his theatrics. When you look at it, this is a man who's wasn't even accused, but readily admitted that he sexually assaulted a woman when he was 15 years old, and yet he is trying to act like an aggrieved male feminist by attacking the character of Judge Kavanaugh. Mazie Hirono, who is one of the most daft, ridiculous people to ever sit in the United States Senate, and doesn't even believe that we should have due process. She's a U.S. senator sworn to uphold the Constitution who doesn't believe in due process, one of the cornerstones of the Constitution and our rule of law. Finally, Kirsten Gillibrand, our own senator from New York. This is a woman who comes from a corrupt political family, who was basically installed at the behest of Senator Alphonse D'Amato, and now is trying to run as a feminist, girl power activist when she has no political principles whatsoever, which even liberals, when pressed, will admit. The whole thing is a complete absurdity. And the fact that Judge Kavanaugh has to even go through this process, he and his family, is infuriating, and should be infuriating to any American who's been watching this even given it a cursory glance. And hopefully more Americans will realize that and call their senators, particularly people like Jeff Flake and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who are too cowardly to take a yes or no stance on this well-qualified judicial nominee. They don't even have the guts to say they won't vote against him. They're merely trying to prolong the process so that his reputation can be further smeared, so that he'll be forced to withdraw. Fortunately, it seems like Brett Kavanaugh is made of sterner stuff, and he won't be bullied into submission. And we can only hope that continues in the future. Well, we'll see what happens next week.
9 more seconds, and we're out of here.